Everyone knows the Great Wall of China was built to keep enemies out. But what if that wasn't the whole story? What if I told you the wall was just as much about keeping China's own people in? Behind the bricks and battlements lies a tale of taxes, trade routes, and a little bit of paranoia. For centuries, it wasn't just armies crossing those hills. It was farmers, merchants, and secrets. So tonight, as you close your eyes and drift into sleep, let's wander quietly if you enjoy relaxing stories like this one. Past the guard towers, subscribe to the channel. Past the windy ridges. It truly helps me stay motivated to keep making more sleepy history tales. This is the real reason every new subscriber exists like a whisper. And don't worry, tell me another bedtime story. Hey guys, Sleeping Face. Tonight we're heading off on a long, winding journey along one of the most famous structures in the world, but don't expect a movie moment. Imagine standing under a hazy sky, a faint wind carrying the dry scent of sand and pine, as you look up at a crumbling stretch of wall that doesn't even reach shoulder height. No dramatic battlements, no epic drumbeats, no armies in silhouette. Just you, the dust, and a surprisingly stubby ridge of stone and dirt that disappears into the hills. That's the Great Wall of China. Or, at least, one of its many versions that you're probably not going to survive this. Because we're about to unspool a history so long, so jumbled, and so sleepily bureaucratic, it might just lull you into the most relaxing nap of your week. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know where in the world you're watching from, and what time it is where you are. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You begin your walk where the tourist buses park. Bright red signs with Mandarin slogans, coffee stands selling bottled tea, and teenagers with selfie sticks flood the entryway. But you slip past the crowds, off to a quiet section less maintained, where the stones crumble slightly under your weight, and weeds push through ancient cracks like sleepy fingers reaching toward the sky. Contrary to the schoolbook illustrations, the Great Wall isn't one perfectly formed serpent of bricks snaking across the mountains. Instead, it's more like the scattered bones of a dragon crescent moon thrown across northern China by careless gods. Bits of wall here, to the channel. Broken towers. It truly helps me stay motivated to keep making more. Some were never connected in the first place. Every new subscriber is like a cities or tell me another bedtime story. Shed. Sleeping Face. It's like discovering the Mona Lisa, but with her face scratched off, repainted 10 different times, and then partially recycled into garden furniture. As you wander along a particularly slanted stretch, you notice the materials change every few meters. In some places, it's hard-packed dirt, brown and sandy like a forgotten trail. Elsewhere, dark gray bricks form delicate arches, with carved holes for shooting arrows. Then suddenly, it's stone slabs, crudely stacked, with moss crawling between them like lazy caterpillars. Each change marks a new dynasty, a new emperor, a new tax policy, or possibly just a new foreman deciding he preferred square stones to round ones. Historians still argue whether the lack of consistency was due to poor planning, desperate budgeting, or just the ancient Chinese equivalent of winging it. You pass what might have been a watchtower once, but it looks more like an abandoned birdhouse now. No roof, one sad window, a pile of broken pottery at its base, and a spider web clinging to the edges like it's given up on catching anything useful. And here's the thing that surprises you most. This whole stretch, it wasn't even built to stop an army. Not this part, at least. Some sections of the wall, especially the early ones, were constructed by local warlords, not emperors. They wanted to show off, claim land, or simply charge tolls from passing merchants. A wall wasn't just a barrier, it was a statement. Like, yes, I'm powerful enough to stack rocks higher than you. Pay up. You reach a segment where the wall runs low and narrow, barely higher than your knees. This might have been a marker between rival states before unification. Think less defensive megastructure and more fancy fence between grumpy neighbors. One thing's clear. The myth of the wall as a single, mighty defense is just that, a myth. What you're walking on is more like a historical collage, a patchwork of political intentions, construction methods, and very tired laborers. And speaking of tired, you imagine the workers who built these sections. Most weren't soldiers or engineers. They were peasants, prisoners, conscripts. Many had no choice in the matter. Ordered to remote mountain regions, armed with shovels and baskets, told to dig and tamp and haul until something resembling a wall appeared. But more on their struggle later. For now, you follow the ridgeline. The wall snakes along it like a lazy thought, neither straight nor ambitious. It bends and dips, often for no clear reason. That's because ancient builders didn't always choose the shortest route. They chose what was available, what wouldn't collapse under weather, or what happened to pass by a quarry. Efficiency was rarely the goal, and sometimes it feels like the wall was built more to impress than to protect. Imagine being a visiting dignitary in ancient China. You're brought to a high cliff, offered warm tea, and told, "Look at that, our great empire's mighty wall, stretching to the heavens." You nod, pretend to be awed, while quietly wondering why it has so many holes in it. But in that moment, it didn't matter. The idea of the wall, the performance of greatness, was more important than its actual function. Even today, that illusion remains powerful. You think about the textbooks, the documentaries, the trivia nights at bars. Everyone remembers the Great Wall. Fewer remember that it failed to stop many invasions, was often unfinished, and was occasionally about as useful as a speed bump made of marshmallows. Still, it stands. At least, in parts. And as you pause to catch your breath, the wind carries a bit of dry grass past your feet. In the distance, the wall disappears into a bank of trees. Broken, beautiful, pointless, proud, but a symbol not of defense, perhaps, but of determination. You yawn. Just a little, because this is going to be a very long walk. Your boots, or rather, your imagination's boots, crunch against the gravelly soil as you step off the last slumped stone and into another stretch of history. Here, the wall isn't even stone anymore. It's just dirt, tall mounds of it, dry and cracking, with tufts of brittle grass pushing through as if trying to protest their own burial. This is where it all began, that you've stepped back in time, way before Ming Dynasty bricks and fancy guard towers. Now you're walking the dust paths of the Warring States period, centuries before China unified under one emperor. Back then, kings of little kingdoms were busy walling each other out like medieval toddlers arguing over who owned which sandbox. Instead of playground insults, they built barriers, but those walls weren't made of stone. Oh no, that would have required an inconvenient thing called logistics. These early barriers were made from rammed earth, which is exactly what it sounds like. A team of laborers, usually peasants, would shovel dirt into wooden frames and then pound it flat using big wooden mallets. Over and over and over, until it hardened into dense, compacted layers. Historians still argue whether the process was more efficient than using stone, or just incredibly convenient for ruling classes who didn't want to pay for anything fancier. Either way, it worked. Sort of. Until it rained. You imagine the scene. A rainy season rolls through, the great dirt ramparts melt like day-old cake, and one warlord wakes up to find his impenetrable border wall now resembles a row of sleepy sand dunes. If you listen closely, you can almost hear the sighs of disappointment echoing down the centuries. But those early builders kept going. They believed in walls the way modern homeowners believe in alarm systems. Maybe they won't stop the determined intruder, but they'll make you feel a little better while you sleep. You kneel and touch one of these compacted walls. It flakes beneath your fingers, ancient soil reduced to the soft powder of centuries. It's hard to imagine thousands of workers laboring for weeks, sometimes months, to raise these structures, only for them to become earthen ghosts. And yet, they did. Because back then, walls weren't really about stopping enemies. They were about showing power. A king could point at his wall and say, "See, my land is this big. My people built that. Respect me." It was, in a way, the medieval version of an Instagram brag. Still, power needs reinforcement. So they put guards on top, often armed with little more than spears and a sturdy set of lungs. These watchmen weren't fending off huge armies. Their job was to spot bandits, smugglers, or neighbors who thought it'd be funny to sneak some sheep over the line. You walk a little further and stumble across the remains of one of these sentry posts. It's barely a mound now, but you can picture it, a rough platform made of timber and earth, manned by one bored teenager with an itchy nose and absolutely no desire to sound the alarm. Because if he did, he'd probably have to run 3 miles downhill to the nearest village, only to find out the invaders were just kids chasing goats. It's worth noting that some of these early walls didn't even face foreign enemies. Nope, they faced inward. You stop. Let that sink in for a moment. Some of these walls were designed not to keep others out, but to keep people in. Kings feared rebellion more than invasion. So if you lived near the edge of the kingdom and started getting ideas, like, say, defecting to a rival state with lower taxes and better tea, you might find yourself staring at a very inconvenient stretch of dirt. Later rulers would perfect this tactic, using walls to control not just movement, but information. News couldn't flow freely. Neither could travelers. And when one dynasty collapsed and another took over, well, they often built new walls right over the old ones, layer after layer. Like geological records of Paranoia, you squint into the distance. A new section rises, higher than the last. Still earth, but better preserved. Maybe because this stretch never saw much action. You climb it slowly, the slope more forgiving than dramatic. No thrilling battlements, no hidden arrow slits, just an endless trail of silence and wind that a lizard darts across your path. You both pause for a moment, equally unsure of who's trespassing on whom. Then it vanishes into a crack, probably more interested in bugs than ancient geopolitics. You reach the top and gaze around. From here, the horizon curls in gentle waves, dry hills folding into one another like a wrinkled blanket. It's peaceful, too peaceful, in fact, which brings us to a strange little tidbit. Many of these early walls weren't placed on high ground for defense. They followed valleys, rivers, or trade paths instead. Why? Historians still argue whether the builders prioritized military advantage or just didn't want to drag supplies up a hill. Human laziness may have shaped more of history than we'll ever know. You run your fingers along a deep groove in the earth, a track left by ancient carts. Sometimes, entire sections of wall doubled as roadways, not for troops, but for farmers and merchants. That's right. Parts of the Great Wall functioned like glorified dirt highways. Because when you've spent months building a flat surface, why not roll some cabbage carts over it? There's a strange practicality to it all. A wall doesn't need to stop everyone. It just needs to slow them down, make them think twice, or at least inconvenience them enough to take the long way around. That's often what these early earth walls did. They weren't fortresses. They were friction.by now. Your pace has slowed to a lazy shuffle. The sun's dipping lower, painting long shadows across the hills. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barks once, then silence returns. You pause that you're not even sure which century you're in anymore. The dirt under your feet has seen so many rulers, so many ambitions and collapses. All of them built, erased, and rebuilt on the same tired land. And yet, somehow the wall, this sleepy, dusty ghost of one still remains. You don't realize how much the landscape has changed until you crest the next ridge. Gone are the crumbly earth mounds and weathered footpaths. Now, beneath your feet, the ground feels firmer, almost militarily so. The bricks are gray, nearly uniform, and arranged with a kind of no-nonsense geometry that screams central authority. Welcome to the Qin dynasty that you've time-traveled to around 221 BCE. And you're in the company of Emperor Qin Shi Huang, the man who decided he didn't like chaos, didn't like regional differences, and definitely didn't like the idea of people leaving his empire without paperwork. So naturally, he commissioned one of the most enormous infrastructure projects in ancient history, connecting and reinforcing the loose patchworks of earlier walls into something that could be called, well, the wall. Not that he built it from scratch. Qin was a fan of recycling. His engineers looked at the raggedy regional walls from the previous warring states period and thought, hey, why not sew this mess together and call it impressive? Think of it like duct taping 5 broken lawn chairs into one really long bench and convincing your guests it's cutting-edge interior design. Of course, it wasn't about aesthetic appeal. Qin's version of the wall was part defense, part propaganda, and part panic attack. Historians still argue whether he really believed it would repel nomadic invasions from the north, or if he mostly wanted to keep his own people under close watch. After all, when you're the first emperor of a newly unified China, your list of enemies includes everyone. You picture it now. Thousands of conscripted workers in chain gang lines, carrying baskets of rock and dirt up steep ridges, some singing songs to pass the time, others too exhausted to breathe. Most weren't soldiers. They were peasants, farmers, even convicts. The wall became their sentence. You run your fingers along the edge of a surviving parapet. It's cool, rough, and unervingly even. A lot of these Qin-era sections were made using a more advanced version of the rammed earth method. Layers of dirt and gravel packed tight between wooden frames, then finished with stone slabs or brick casings. From a distance, it looked impenetrable. Up close, well, let's just say weather was still the enemy, but so was everything else. The wall became a death trap for its builders. Labor conditions were brutal, supplies were scarce, and the terrain wasn't exactly gentle. Mountain passes, desert stretches, freezing winters, scorching summers. Some historians estimate hundreds of thousands died during its construction. You pause. Beneath your feet, the soil may still hold their bones, though, unlike pyramids or cathedrals, these laborers weren't buried with honor. No names carved in stone, no incense burned for remembrance, just dust and silence. Legend even claims the wall was literally built over the dead, that workers too weak to continue were buried where they collapsed, sealed inside the wall itself. Historians debate whether this was common or just poetic horror passed down by word of mouth. But either way, the imagery lingers. You glance over the ridge. Beyond it lies a valley that was once the northern frontier, home to nomadic tribes the Qin emperor feared above all. He didn't just want to keep them out. He wanted to block their way of life. Qin's walls weren't just physical, they were cultural barriers. The empire was ordered, bureaucratic, agrarian. The nomads were mobile, unpredictable, and didn't particularly care for taxes to the Qin court. Mobility meant rebellion. And rebellion? That meant troubled. The wall became a kind of "you shall not pass" gesture, not just to foreign armies, but to the entire idea of living freely. It wasn't merely built to repel invaders. It was built to project control. You imagine a government inspector riding along the ridge on horseback, squinting down at the horizon, not looking for threats, but for defectors. Anyone trying to sneak out of the empire. Or perhaps smuggle messages in. Or maybe just leave. That's the twist, isn't it? This so-called defensive structure, often had more to do with the people inside than with any looming enemy outside. It wasn't always about safety. Sometimes it was about surveillance. A giant stone exclamation mark that said, "Stay." You sit for a moment on one of the broader steps, letting your eyes trace the line of the wall as it disappears into the mountain fog. It's hard not to be impressed, even if a little creeped out. The sheer ambition of it, the human cost, the paranoia baked into every brick. And here's something a bit unexpected. Some of the earliest Great Wall projects under Qin weren't even continuous. They were fragmented zones with gaps, intended not to physically stop invaders, but to funnel them into specific routes, where Chinese troops could ambush them more easily. The idea wasn't airtight defense. It was channeling and control, like a maze. But with spears waiting at the end, you spot a carved symbol on a stone near your feet. It's faint, weathered, but still visible, a seal of the imperial court. Proof that even these remote sections were part of a larger bureaucracy. Imagine filing inspection paperwork for a wall that stretches over 10,000 kilometers. And you thought your spreadsheets were overwhelming. Still, as harsh as Emperor Qin was, his wall laid the blueprint for the centuries to come. Later dynasties would rebuild it, extend it, upgrade it, and, of course, use it as a billboard for their own legitimacy. Each emperor trying to outwall the last. Bigger, better, more impressive, fewer casualties, hopefully. Hopefully, as you start walking again, the mist thickens around you. The wall becomes less a structure and more a suggestion, peeking in and out of the fog like an idea struggling to stay relevant. It's quiet, haunting, and oddly beautiful. You breathe deep. The air here smells of dry moss and distant firewood. Somewhere behind you, Qin's empire rises, glorious and short-lived. Somewhere ahead, new dynasties wait with fresh bricks and different anxieties. But for now, you just walk. Your feet land with a soft thud on yet another section of the wall. This time, you barely recognize it as the same structure. The bricks are newer, the stonework tighter, and the parapets finally start to resemble those dramatic images from movies and travel brochures. But something still feels off that you've stepped into the Han Dynasty now, and you're starting to realize something. This wall, if we can even keep calling it the wall, has identity issues. You feel it in the structure. Some parts stretch high and proud, others dip into ditches like a lazy shrug. Over here, a fortress with battlements. Over there, just a dry trench with some piles of rubble and a sign that says, "No climbing." If the wall were a person, you'd gently suggest therapy. That's because no one could quite agree on what the wall was for. And not just between emperors. Within the same dynasty, you'll find wildly different approaches. The Han, for example, loved the wall, but mostly as a way to manage trade. That's right, not for war. For commerce, you pass a gap in the wall where an old gate once stood. This would have been a checkpoint. A place to collect tolls from Silk Road caravans rolling in from the west, their camels jingling under heavy loads of jade, spices, and gossip. You can almost hear the arguments over bribes, the clinking of coins, the rustle of papyrus documents being forged or misplaced. Historians still argue whether the Han Wall was ever meant to be a consistent border or just a really expensive way to make smugglers' lives slightly more annoying. But even within this dynasty, the wall's mood kept changing. Some sections were garrisoned heavily, filled with soldiers, supplies, and beacon towers that lit up at the first sign of trouble. Others were neglected so long that desert shrubs claimed them like squatters. At one point, a section was reportedly used to herd sheep, a defensive masterpiece turned into an elaborate fence for fluffy livestock. You keep walking and notice grooves in the stone, wagon wheels, maybe. Or maybe the deep toe drags of soldiers who were just done with another patrol shift. You imagine them muttering under their breath, dreaming of rice wine and retirement. Then you reach a crossroads. Literally, a small watch station. Now nothing more than stacked stones and sun-bleached roof tiles. Once stood where several trade routes intersected. Not a battleground, a business hub. Wall guards here were part customs agents, part border patrol, and part therapists for tired merchants. They kept the goods flowing, the taxes collected, and the eye rolls frequent. You sit on a low wall and let your imagination drift. Picture a bored soldier scribbling poetry in the margins of his logbook, a trader bribing his way through with a sack of cinnamon, or a traveling monk arguing about which side of the wall had the better dumplings. It's oddly human, all of it. Because while emperors debated strategy and historians still bicker about intent, the people who lived and worked along the wall adapted it to their needs. Farming, praying, trading, or even just napping in the shade of a tower. One official report from the Han era complained about guards falling asleep on duty so frequently that special inspection teams had to be sent out, only for them to fall asleep too. But seriously, imagine patrolling the same stretch of wall day after day, in freezing wind or desert heat, with nothing to see except more rocks, the occasional scorpion, and the slow decay of your enthusiasm. You'd probably snooze too. This wasn't the glamorized history of emperors and battles. This was the history of dry rations, itchy uniforms, and probably a lot of intestinal complaints from drinking well water that doubled as a camel bath. You stand again and move forward. The wall climbs here, up a steep slope, the kind that makes your calves ache just looking at it. Why build it on such an incline? Well, because that's where the border was that year. And next year, it might be 10 kilometers north or south. The definition of defense line was a bit flexible. Remember those early Qin walls? The Han sometimes used them as foundations, sometimes ignored them entirely. New emperors always think they know better. So they built on top, or next to, or diagonally across from the old ones. Like historical graffiti layered over itself again and again. That's why today's Great Wall is more like a family scrapbook than a single architectural marvel. You're walking on generations of interpretation, argument, and fatigue. A monument to emperors who couldn't agree on policy and workers who never got a say in the matter. You finally reach the top of the hill and look out. The view is stunning, of course. Endless sky, sweeping plains, wind brushing against your cheeks like the quiet sigh of ancient bureaucracy. But something else catches your eye. In the distance, a river cuts through the land. That river? A wall once stopped there. Because water was considered a natural defense. Why build across it? Too expensive. So a chunk of the wall simply ends at the bank like a sentence abandoned mid-thought. But guess what? That's where most invaders entered. Yes, despite all this building, all this labor, and all these glorious imperial decrees, determined enemies often just found a hole, walked around, bribed a guard, crossed a river during the dry season. One even disguised himself as a merchant selling yak meat. Historians still argue whether the Han strategy was naive or just economically pragmatic. But either way, this section of the wall wasn't the Iron Curtain of legend. It was more like a chain-link fence with a big friendly sign. Please don't invade. But if you must, be nice. You start your descent now, your footsteps slowing as the sky takes on that gentle evening blue. Crickets chirp in the underbrush. A breeze kicks up dust along the path, and the wall, well, it continues ahead, winding, fading, reappearing. Still unsure if it's a sword, a border, a stage, or just the world's longest scenic detour. Whatever it is, you're still walking it. The wind shifts direction as you move forward, carrying the scent of distant pine and dry stone. Your path winds gently downhill now, but the terrain isn't what it used to be. Gone are the Han checkpoints and crumbling trenches. This part of the wall is jagged, raw, and strangely quiet. as if even the wind is holding its breath that you're standing on the frontier during a very uncomfortable moment in Chinese history. The Song dynasty has collapsed, the Yuan dynasty is on the rise, and a certain group of horseback enthusiasts, otherwise known as the Mongols, are about to put the whole Great Wall to the test. Spoiler alert, the wall doesn't do great. You walk a bit further and stop at what looks like the ruins of a gatehouse. Its stone base still stands, barely, but its wood is long gone. It might have once held an iron gate, a few centuries, maybe even a pot of boiling oil for dramatic effect. But now it's just a sun-bleached outline of things that failed to stop what was coming. Because here's the thing about the wall. It was often built under the assumption that invaders would be polite enough to approach it like a locked door. Line up, knock, get refused, go home, the Mongols. They had horses. And more importantly, they had options that you trace your fingers along the foundation stones. You picture a Mongol scouting party riding parallel to the wall, scanning it like a hedge maze. They're not impressed. They don't see an impenetrable fortress. They see logistics, supply lines, guard shifts, gaps, and the Great Wall had gaps. Lots of them. Natural breaks at rivers, mountains, or simply places where construction had stalled because the funding dried up. Some stretches were never connected at all. There were even reports of entire sections that had been abandoned by their garrisons because, well, winter was hard, food was scarce, and why freeze guarding a glorified pile of rocks? You take a seat on a flat stone and think about that. The wall was meant to symbolize control, but in practice, it exposed the limits of control that it turns out you can build something 13,000 miles long and still have someone just go around it. The Mongols, under Genghis Khan and later Kublai Khan, did exactly that. They didn't storm every section. They bypassed or bribed, exploited poor maintenance, or simply overwhelmed small garrisons who'd rather survive than be martyrs for poorly written defense policies. Yet there's a popular idea that the wall was breached in some climactic, fiery moment of conquest. But really, it was more like a leaky faucet. Little by little, people slipped through, deals were made, treaties broken, roads opened. You remember hearing about Jiaguan Pass, a famous fortress in western China often called the end of the wall. Beautiful, grand, towering over the desert. The legend goes that the Mongols were baffled by its defenses. But the truth? Kublai Khan's army owned that area. Why attack a fortress when you already run the postal service behind it? The irony deepens when you realize that after the Mongols took over China and established the Yuan dynasty, they didn't tear the wall down. No, they used it. Not for defense. Remember, they were the invaders, but for managing borders, collecting taxes, and keeping local warlords from getting ideas. The wall switched sides without even moving a brick. A passive-aggressive stone ribbon being repurposed, repainted, and renamed with every regime. You walk again. The wall is quiet now, and you notice animal tracks in the dust, small deer, maybe. They don't care about dynasties or border patrols. They probably use the wall for shade or just as a nice elevated bathroom. You chuckle softly. Farther along, a sign, rusty, modern, marks this stretch as reconstructed Yuan-era foundations. There's barely anything visible except a few arranged stones in a half-circle, like forgotten camping chairs. It's humble, understated, and somehow appropriate. Historians still argue whether the Yuan dynasty seriously invested in the wall or just maintained a few key stretches to save face. But one thing is clear, its purpose had already shifted again. From military deterrent to administrative suggestion. You wonder how many local governors stood on this wall, gazing at the horizon, more worried about tax collection than Tatar raids. How many border guards read poetry during quiet hours, sharp and dull, swords out of boredom, or simply traded gossip with passing merchants. Because by now, The wall wasn't just a military tool, it was a workplace. And like any workplace, people adapted. They carved little ledges for teapots, scratched their names into bricks, maybe even carved inappropriate drawings in places no imperial inspector would check. You spot a pile of discarded tiles nearby, some of them etched with faded characters. Not commands, not military orders, but prayers, wishes, a guard asking for good harvest, a child's name. One tile simply says, "I miss my wife." It's easy to forget that behind all the grandeur and mythology, the wall was walked, lived, and slept on by real people. And real people get tired, hungry, lonely, and cold. They don't dream of defending empires. They dream of going home. The sun is lower now. The shadow of the wall stretches across a small hill. It doesn't feel like a symbol of power anymore. It feels tired, like it's done enough, like it's watched too many kings rise and fall to take any of them seriously now. You rest a moment longer. You followed the wall through shifting borders, through false promises of invincibility, and through the boots of invaders who couldn't care less about how great it claimed to be. And somehow, through all of that, it's still here, sort of a cracked trail, a suggestion of glory, a very long, very expensive misunderstanding. And yet, you keep walking. You trudge along the winding mountain paths of northern China, and it feels as though the stones beneath your feet carry 1,000 ghost stories, some more bureaucratic than dramatic. As the wall twists and climbs through misty ridges, you imagine a network of watchtowers perched like sleepy sentinels, quietly observing an enemy that might never show up. See, despite its dramatic scale and spine-like stance across the landscape, the Great Wall wasn't primarily designed for massive battlefield clashes. Instead, it excelled at one thing: micromanagement. Specifically, border control. Centuries before modern-day customs officers and passport stamps, the emperors of China needed to keep track of who entered and left their empire. Not because they feared hordes of invaders every day, but because commerce, livestock, taxation, and the occasional rebellious peasant all needed monitoring. And where better to do that than at the literal edge of the world? So, yes, there were guards stationed here, but not in the noble warrior waiting to duel a Mongol general at dawn kind of way. More like overworked administrators with scrolls, ink-stained fingers, and a perpetual headache from tracking sheep herders, smugglers, and suspicious-looking bundles of dried fruit. You arrive at a checkpoint, a gate nestled within the wall. Picture a weary guard squinting at a merchant wagon packed with salted fish and dubious medicinal herbs. He lifts his brush, dips it in ink, and notes everything down with the solemnity of a man who knows he'll lose half his paperwork to wind gusts by noon. This was standard procedure in many stretches of the Ming-era wall. Historians still argue whether the majority of guard stations were truly militarized or more administrative. Some structures show evidence of garrison living, bunks, cooking areas, weapon racks. Others feel suspiciously like toll booths, designed more for counting chickens than deflecting arrows. And then there were the taxes. Ah yes, the sweet incentive to build a stone labyrinth across mountain ranges, revenue collection. The wall's passes offered the government a chance to intercept traveling merchants and demand dues. In fact, one little-known document from the Ming period describes a dispute between two guards over whether dried apricots counted as a luxury item. Spoiler, the apricots lost. This level of border scrutiny was particularly intense during times of peace. When war simmered down, the wall's martial purpose took a back seat to economic regulation. Some officials even proposed expanding it, not to stop invasions, but to encourage orderly trade routes. That's like adding speed bumps on a highway because traffic's moving too smoothly. Occasionally, local farmers and traders found ways to bypass. They discovered soft spots, hidden pathways, or even bribed guards with jars of pickled eel to not notice the goats they were sneaking through after sunset. Bureaucratic ingenuity met peasant creativity, and frankly, it was beautiful that in some stretches, guards had a reputation not for being brave, but corrupt. Stories swirled of double checkpointing, where a caravan had to pay an entrance fee, then an exit fee, even though they'd never actually passed through any second gate. The Great Wall, ladies and gentlemen, history's most scenic toll road, but don't be too hard on these men. Life on the wall wasn't glamorous. Picture it. Weeks without seeing a soul beyond your squad, dry rations, howling winds, and paperwork that would crumble if you looked at it funny. One diary fragment, written by a lonely outpost guard, simply reads, "Wind. Cold. Nothing today. Stole rice from Chun. He deserved it." Deep stuff. And yet, the wall did create a semblance of order. In a time when border fluidity could lead to raids, famine, or political chaos, it allowed the central government to keep a watchful eye, albeit with thick stone spectacles. It didn't always succeed, of course. Borders were still crossed, laws still bent. But there's something comfortingly human about a defensive structure being used to argue over goat tariffs. You pause at one old gate, its timbers long rotted, but still bearing faint traces of painted characters. A relic from a time when the flow of tea leaves and rice sacks was as important as arrows and shields. And as the night wind brushes against the ancient stones, you realize the wall wasn't so much about war as it was about control. Quiet, methodical, obsessive control over the little things. Like the number of ducks waddling past a checkpoint, or the suspicious rise in silk scarves declared as family heirlooms. The next time someone tells you the Great Wall was purely a military defense, gently offer them a scroll, a seal, and a form to fill out in triplicate. And don't forget to stamp it. You're standing on the edge of a sun-blasted outpost, your face brushed by hot wind that smells faintly of sand and stone. This isn't a scenic tourist checkpoint with a vending machine and a gift shop. It's a scraggly, half-forgotten corner of the Great Wall, far from Beijing, where the stones crumble and only the wind seems to patrol. You shift your weight, imagining what it felt like to be stationed here, back when this stretch was active, 1,000 miles from home, staring out into the nothing. Because while you probably imagine the wall as this grand, continuous, dragon-like sweep across China, truth is, it was never one seamless ribbon. It was more like a dotted line on a dry map. Different stretches, built by different dynasties at different times, often with zero intention of being joined. And by the time of the Ming Dynasty, the last major wall builders, it still wasn't a perfectly connected whole. Just an enormous, tangled patchwork of guard towers, trenches, and mud brick extensions, winding in a general direction like a toddler drawing a snake. Some of it wasn't even stone. Let's talk about tamped earth. Huge sections of the wall, especially in the western deserts, were made by literally smashing layers of sand, soil, reeds, and gravel into molds. You'd be posted out here, stacking dry stuff and stomping it down. Over and over again. Not exactly the glamorous side of empire building, but here's the kicker. Historians still argue whether those remote, fragile segments were ever even used. Did troops actually man those western stretches, or were they symbolic? Just a dusty statement to potential raiders that said, yes, this land is claimed, even if no one's here right now. And symbolic gestures weren't uncommon. In fact, the wall was just as much about psychological warfare as it was about bricks. The illusion of impenetrability worked better than the actual logistics ever did. That towering sight over the ridge, it might have been hollow or unmanned, but it gave the impression of a powerful, watchful empire. That was often enough. Now zoom in closer. Picture yourself as a low-ranking soldier assigned to a post near the Gobi Desert. You've got limited water, limited food, and no TikTok to pass the time. You might get one message a month if the messenger doesn't get lost or eaten by wolves. Wolves were a thing, by the way, or bandits, or both. You sleep in a stone hut with a fire that barely keeps out the cold desert nights and the howling winds, still romanticizing the Great Wall yet. Here's a weird one. Some of the earliest watchtowers may have used urine-soaked paper to detect enemy movement. No joke. The idea was that the salt in the urine would react with the air currents if someone passed nearby, causing the paper to flutter more erratically. Creative surveillance or just ancient busy work? We'll never know for sure. But someone definitely sat around thinking, you know what this tower needs? More pee. As you walk alongside a particularly barren stretch, the scenery barely changes. Scrubland to your left, dusty hills to your right. You stumble on a scattering of bones. Not human. Thankfully, just the remains of an old transport donkey, probably left behind when a supply line failed. Supply lines failed often, and while you're absorbing all this emptiness, let's debunk another myth. The idea that the wall actually kept invaders out. Multiple major invasions swept through despite the wall. Mongols, Manchus, even internal rebellions. They either bribed their way through gates or walked around the ends. Sometimes they just waited for winter, when remote posts got abandoned, and marched in like they owned the place. You scratch your head, thinking, so, was all this wall stuff kind of pointless? And honestly, that's the debate. Some scholars believe the wall's true function wasn't military at all. It was economic. A massive toll booth network. Control the checkpoints, regulate the trade, extract taxes from merchants. Others think it was a job creation scheme for restless peasants after years of civil war. Go build that wall, the emperor might have said. It'll take 20 years, and by then, maybe we'll be dead and someone else can deal with the Mongols. Either way, the wall stretches on. Your feet crunch gravel. The silence is almost meditative if you ignore the occasional buzz of desert insects. You pass a broken tower, its top half collapsed, a few bricks blackened from some long-forgotten fire. Someone likely cooked there once. Or maybe it was struck by lightning. No records remain. It's just there, existing, like so many of the wall's fragments. Quiet, anonymous, not even trying to be remembered. And yet, despite it all, the flaws, the gaps, the historical inaccuracies, you can't help but feel something. A connection to the ghosts who passed through here. The builders with blistered hands. The sentries who dreamed of dumplings back home. The merchants who tried to dodge taxes. The messengers who got lost in the dunes. Because no matter how broken or scattered it may be, the wall still holds its story. You just have to listen closely and have a lot of time on your hands. Luckily, you're not going anywhere for a while. And so, you climb the steep, uneven slope of time to reach the era of the Ming Dynasty, where the Great Wall begins its final transformation, not into something new, but into something vastly familiar. This is the wall you see on postcards, on TV documentaries, and maybe even in that one Hollywood movie where Matt Damon fights monsters. That wall, the long snake of stone curling over ridgelines and tumbling down into valleys, owes its distinctive look to a dynasty deeply obsessed with structure, order, and making a serious architectural statement. You are now in the 14th century. The Mongols are still causing trouble in the north. The Ming emperors, especially the early ones like Hongwu and Yongle, are determined not to let China fall under foreign rule again. And what better way to do that than by going full fortress mode? You trudge forward, and under your feet, the wall is no longer tamped earth. It's stone, granite in the mountains, kiln-fired bricks in the lowlands. The Ming took the old scattered frontier walls and turned them into one interconnected dragon spine, stretching across more than 13,000 miles. If you include all the branches, side walls, and repetitions. Think of it as a DIY mega project that says, "Do not enter." Ever. The Ming Wall isn't just longer. It's more intense. It's higher, often 25 feet tall. Wider, about 4 horses abreast in places. And it bristles with towers, bastions, and beacons. Every few hundred yards, you've got a watchtower. Soldiers were stationed inside, some living there year-round, in rooms so small you could touch both walls at once. Warm and cozy, right? If you liked hard beds and harder winters. The thing is, the wall still wasn't a perfectly effective military defense. By the time the Ming were putting up their strongest sections, firearms and cannons were becoming more common. A determined army could just blast a hole through the bricks, or, more commonly, just bribe a board guard to open a gate. In fact, the fall of the Ming dynasty in the 1600s came not from some dramatic siege, but from a rebel general who strolled right through a wall gate after convincing the guards to switch sides. So much for that impenetrable defense. And here's a sleepy twist for you. Historians still argue whether the Great Wall's primary function was ever military at all. Sure, it was built to keep threats out, but it was just as much about keeping Chinese subjects in. The Ming emperors didn't want peasants fleeing taxes, or criminals slipping over the border, or merchants getting too friendly with Mongol traders. The wall wasn't just a barrier, it was a boundary. A bold, unmistakable line that said, "This is China." That is not. As you trail your fingers along a stretch of Ming brickwork, you notice something odd. A handful of wall sections curve dramatically for no apparent reason. Some even circle back like they forgot which direction they were going. Why? Possibly to increase visibility between towers. Possibly to frustrate potential invaders. Or maybe, just maybe, because the engineers got a little bored. After all, if you're stuck building a wall across half a continent, wouldn't you sneak in some curves for fun? Quirkier still, some sections of the Ming Wall have names like the Wall That Leans on Heaven or the Stone Dragon, names given not by historians, but by the builders and locals who lived and worked beside it. These people didn't think of the wall as a political boundary or a symbol of national pride. To them, it was part of the landscape, a place where grandfathers once hauled stones, a windy ridge where your cousin's sheep always ran off, a background for gossip, ghost stories, and naps in the sun. You pause to rest in the shadow of one of the larger towers. The wind rattles through the arrow slits. A pigeon coos somewhere above. You imagine what it must have been like to be posted here for months, maybe years. Your only visitors are dust, wind, and the occasional command scroll from Beijing. You're supposed to light a signal fire if trouble approaches, but honestly, most nights, you're too busy playing dice or writing poems on the walls with charcoal. One old tower still has the remains of a poem scratched into its bricks. Roughly translated, it reads, "The wind howls like a mother who lost her son / but I sleep anyway, back against stone." You laugh quietly, a breathless puff in the cold air. You get it. You're not here for conquest. You're here for quiet. As twilight descends in your imagination, the Ming Wall stretches ahead like an ancient artery. From space, they say, you can see it with the naked eye. Spoiler, you can't. That's just a myth. It's too narrow and too camouflaged by terrain. But from where you're standing, with the valleys dimming and the mountains throwing long purple shadows, the wall feels enormous. Not just in size, but in story. You press your palm against the cool stone, letting the centuries hum beneath your fingers. This wall may not have kept all the invaders out. It may not have stood firm against every cannon blast or desert wind, but it endures. And sometimes that's enough. And so you find yourself tracing the dusty ridgeline where the Great Wall climbs into the clouds, brick by weary brick. Your eyes settle on the stones beneath your feet. Not quite uniform, not quite perfect, and certainly not built in a day. That myth about a single, grand construction effort? Utter nonsense. This wasn't a monument of swift imperial will. It was a project dragged out over centuries, started and stopped, patched and forgotten, then remembered again. Think of it as the world's longest group project, spanning dynasties, egos, and at least 3 different styles of mortar. Tonight, you're walking through one of the strangest eras of the wall's evolution, the transition from the Mongol-led Yuan dynasty back to the Han-led Ming. And this wasn't just a changing of the guard, it was a total renovation. Imagine inheriting a fixer-upper the size of a continent, complete with crumbling bastions, half-finished towers, and a reputation for not really doing what it was supposed to do. The Ming emperors were nothing if not ambitious. After overthrowing the Mongols in the 14th century, they decided it was time to make the wall great again, literally. But not just any wall. This version would be taller, stronger, and somehow even more bureaucratic. That's right, the Ming Wall wasn't just built with bricks, but with red tape. Every foot of it was monitored, logged, and double-checked by officials whose titles you'd need an Excel spreadsheet to keep straight. You shuffle past a reconstruction site from the 1470s. The sound of clinking trowels and shouted orders from overseers fills the air, or at least your imagination of it. This was no amateur hour. The Ming brought in proper architects, drafted soldiers as construction crews, and imposed heavy taxes to fund it all. Laborers toiled for years, sometimes decades, under scorching suns and biting winds. And what was their reward? Usually sore backs, sunburns, and if they were lucky, a slightly less leaky watchtower to sleep in. Here's the kicker. The Ming were building inward. Not just along the old borders, but closer to the imperial core, suggesting, perhaps, that they feared internal unrest just as much as the northern nomads. Some scholars still argue whether this wasn't really about defense at all, but about sending a message. The wall became less about practical military use and more about imperial psychology. Look, it said, we're strong, serious, and very good at stacking stones. But it wasn't all stone. You paused to touch the smooth surface of tamped earth near a less glamorous section. Many parts were still made the old-fashioned way, pounded dirt and wood reinforcements, especially in more remote provinces. So while the tourist brochures today love to show you the sturdy brick and stone marvel snaking over mountains near Beijing, remember that huge stretches remained humble and, frankly, kind of disappointing. That let's not forget the logistics nightmare. Supplying laborers across thousands of miles with food, tools, and tea required a supply chain that would make Amazon blush. Grain was hauled in from distant provinces. Bricks had to be baked on site because transporting them over long distances was too costly. Mules collapsed. Porters collapsed. Morale collapsed. And yet, somehow, the wall grew as you walk along a misty stretch, quiet, save for the hum of a night breeze. You imagine what it must have felt like to be stationed here. Not a general, mind you, but a low-ranking soldier pulling double duty as a construction worker. You'd wake up, check the horizon for invaders or clouds or anything interesting, and then start moving rocks again. Your biggest fear? Not a Mongol charge, but boredom and the occasional work accident involving a runaway wheelbarrow. Quirky side note, among the Ming Wall's lesser-known features were its fire beacon stations. You picture these stubby towers, each within visual range of the next, ready to send smoke signals or torchlight to alert of enemy movement. Think of it as a painfully slow version of Twitter with a strict 140-character limit in the form of smoke puffs. Horsemen spotted, 10 of them, or maybe goats. There were also special whistle walls, designed to amplify the sound of alarms across valleys. And sections of the wall were deliberately curved, not for aesthetics, but for acoustics, so a shouted warning could carry farther. Pretty clever for an empire that had just rediscovered gunpowder. Still, historians debate how effective the wall truly was. It's hard to measure success when your opponent rides around it or bribes the gatekeepers. Many argue the Ming Wall wasn't about preventing invasions at all, but managing them. Slow them down, channel them, maybe buy time to rally the cavalry. In that sense, it was more speed bump than shield. You pause at a wall carving, weathered, barely visible, left by a Ming laborer. A name, perhaps, or a prayer. Maybe it says, "If you're reading this, I'm still stacking bricks." And so the wall expands, not just in size, but in scope. A military project becomes a psychological monument. A dusty pile of rocks becomes a symbol of national will. And all the while, you keep walking, slowly, sleepily, along this strange, stubborn thread that stitches history together. By now, you've meandered along stretches of the wall lined with battlements and gaps, long since lost their meaning. But as you push further into the quieter, more remote corners, where the wall becomes a crumbling ribbon, stitched into the curves of lonely valleys and wind-blasted ridges, something changes. You're no longer walking on a monument. It starts to feel like you're walking on a memory, or at least what a memory would feel like if it were made of dust and stone. This part of the wall, far from the eyes of tour guides and Instagram filters, was never built to impress. In fact, parts of it weren't even stone. The sections stretching into the western deserts were often made of rammed earth, essentially compacted sand and dirt, layered over and over until it formed something solidish. If you've ever made a sandcastle with wet hands and a lot of time, congratulations. You've basically done ancient Chinese military engineering. You kick up dust with every step. It's so dry here that the wind whistles past with no moisture to carry. The desert isn't quiet. It just talks in a way you weren't expecting. Low, humming gusts through broken watchtowers, the crunch of brittle weeds underfoot, and your own footsteps, echoing across nothing. And here's the secret. This barren section of the wall was never about keeping people out. It was about showing that people were already here. A massive, visible, stubborn line, declaring this land belongs to someone. Historians still argue whether these western branches were even defensive. There's little record of battles, but there's plenty of tax records, burial sites, and administrative inscriptions. Bureaucracy, it turns out, is just as durable as stone. Take the Jade Gate, for instance, a fortification that sounds mythical but was mostly a customs checkpoint. Traders on the Silk Road had to pass through it, declare their goods, and occasionally bribe someone just to get a stamp. If you thought airport security was tedious, imagine explaining your cargo of dried dates and Persian carpets to a guard whose only entertainment is counting camels. Still, that stretch of wall mattered. For the Han Dynasty, the Western Wall was about projection, an announcement of their borders, their reach, and their ability to tax whatever wandered close enough. The wall wasn't a shield. It was a spotlight, and not a very efficient one at that. In fact, one quirky theory claims that the Han-era wall segments were built partially to impress local nomads. That's right, less fortress, more flex. Look how organized we are. Look how many laborers we can command. Look at our massive line in the sand. It's less about defense and more about vibes. And speaking of laborers, let's talk about those. You can't walk this path without imagining the people who bled into it. These weren't volunteers. They were prisoners, conscripts, farmers behind on taxes. Some were political dissidents who said the wrong thing to the wrong eunuch on the wrong Tuesday. A quiet debate still hums in academic circles about whether the wall's western reaches ever truly served military strategy, or if they were more like a jobs program wrapped in barbed ideology. It's the ancient version of shovel-ready projects. But instead of shovels, they had wicker baskets and buckets of dirt, and those workers left their marks, not in history books, but in the materials themselves. In certain sun-scorched stretches, archaeologists have found fingerprints. Actual, fossilized finger grooves from where someone pressed a handful of wet earth into place. It's strangely intimate, standing where someone else once stood, shaping mud into empire, probably cursing under their breath. You stop and squat down beside one of these spots. There's no signage, no glossy plaque, just a smear in ancient cement, the kind of artifact that museums overlook but time protects. As the sun starts to lower, casting red light across the dunes, your mind drifts. You try to picture a watchman stationed here, sand in his teeth, cold nights and boiling days, probably bored out of his mind, scratching characters into wood just to pass the time. Maybe he wrote letters to no one. Maybe he named the local lizards. Back then, there wasn't a sense of permanence. The wall wasn't some timeless marvel. It was just there, part of the job, part of life, a line to patrol, a base to man, a punishment to endure, and yet, here it still stands, crumbling, faint, but present. So, you lean against one of the rammed earth bastions, not expecting stability, but finding just enough to rest your weight. It's warm from the sun. It smells like old paper and dry air. You imagine someone doing the same 2,000 years ago, just a moment of quiet before the next patrol, or before they realize, once again, that the wall was never meant to stop an enemy. It was meant to say, "We're still here," themselves mending and manning it. In one of history's great ironies, the Mongol Yuan dynasty, once proud destroyers of walls, became administrators of them. They reinforced certain sections, stationed troops, and even expanded upon some defensive outposts, not because they feared another nomadic invasion, but because they needed to manage the very empire they had conquered. And here's where it gets almost poetic. The wall, once a symbol of division between the so-called civilized world and the nomadic barbarians, now served the needs of a government born from those very steps. It was no longer just a barrier, but a boundary for trade caravans, a toll point for silk merchants, and an early warning system for potential troublemakers, both foreign and domestic. Travelers during this time described these walls not as impenetrable fortresses, but as checkpoints buzzing with life. Imagine a sleepy garrison of former steppe warriors checking inventory on spice shipments, or issuing travel papers in broken Mandarin. Somewhere, you suspect, Genghis Khan might have raised an eyebrow at that turn of fate. Of course, the wall's status as an active defense never fully disappeared. It just adapted, much like the people around it. It ceased to be a magical line in the sand and became something far more mundane: infrastructure. And in that quiet, bureaucratic transformation, we get a glimpse of something more profound. Even the grandest symbols of isolation and aggression eventually become just another piece of the administrative puzzle. Like an ancient spreadsheet made of stone, filed away under things to fix after the harvest. The Great Wall's role as infrastructure only deepened under later dynasties. By the time the Ming took the reins in the 14th century, the wall had become less a monument to failed defenses and more a logistical backbone. The Ming, forever wary of nomadic resurgence, undertook one of the most ambitious public works projects in world history, rebuilding, reinforcing, and reconnecting fragmented sections into what most of us recognize today as the Great Wall. But let's be clear, this wasn't a continuous ribbon of stone zigzagging across the land like in the postcards. It was more like a patchwork quilt, a series of walls and fortifications tailored to geography, politics, and local budgets. Still, the effort was monumental. Entire villages were conscripted to haul stone, bake bricks, and pack tamped earth into battlements. Some laborers never returned home. Those stones were mortared with more than lime. And yet, despite all this, the wall still couldn't guarantee security. Raids still happened. Corruption still festered at the gates. Even after centuries of upgrades and slogans carved into stone about loyalty and vigilance, it remained what it had always been, a tool, not a solution. Over time, the wall's symbolism shifted once again. No longer just a military asset, it became a cultural landmark. It marked the edge of civilized China, the line where fields ended and wilderness began. Poets wrote verses beneath its shadow. Emperors used it in speeches. Tourists, centuries later, would marvel at it and ask strange questions like, "Can you see it from space?" But to the farmers who tilled the land beside it, to the soldiers who froze on its towers, and to the emperors who lost sleep over its breaches, the wall was never just a wall. It was hope, fear, propaganda, bureaucracy, and yes, occasionally, just a really expensive windbreak. Imagine you're walking through a jungle path, soft earth beneath your feet, the air thick with humidity and the hum of unseen insects. Somewhere ahead, beyond a curtain of vines, lies a forgotten village, once thriving, now swallowed whole by the forest. You're here not for treasure, but for a salad ingredient. That's not a joke. Among the many mysteries of the Khmer Empire's decline is the disappearance of certain native crops, vegetables once common in daily meals, now relegated to folklore and dusty corners of regional libraries. One such crop was called tro nong, a leafy green described in 17th century texts as bitter like rain on the tongue, with the scent of wet stone. Poetic? Absolutely. But edible? Definitely. Tro nong was said to grow best at the edge of temple ponds, fed by sacred spring water and shaded by stone carvings of Nagas and Apsaras. Villagers used its young leaves in soups, its stems in herbal tonics, and its roots in a dish vaguely translated as temple pickle. But the plant needed a very specific environment, one that faded as the temples crumbled and water systems failed. That be why the time French botanists arrived in the 19th century, they could only find references to the plant in oral accounts and crumbling scrolls. Attempts to identify it yielded conflicting results. Some believe it was a type of wild chicory. Others think it may have been an aquatic relative of the mustard green. Whatever it was, tro nong is now a culinary ghost. Today, a few chefs in Phnom Penh have attempted to recreate the taste using modern substitutes. One even tried to recultivate it using clues from ancient manuscripts. But no one has managed to truly bring it back. It's as though the plant, like the empire that nurtured it, needed a kind of harmony we no longer know how to make. Let us end not with a mystery, but with a whisper. Picture a Khmer elder sitting beneath the eaves of a stilted wooden house, stirring a pot of fragrant broth. They lean forward to tell you something, a memory, not a recipe. It's about a flower that once grew only on the temple steps during the last week of the dry season. They call it Kansing Rum, which roughly means the gathering scent. According to fading village lore, Kansing Rum wasn't grown in gardens. It appeared, as if summoned, when the moon was right and the prayers were said. Its petals were pale gold, and its flavor, if you dared to nibble one, was said to be sweet like honey yet bitter like sandalwood. It wasn't used in everyday meals, but in a ceremonial dish offered to ancestors and spirits. No one ate it alone. No one dared plant it. Over time, the rituals faded. The dish disappeared. The flower, once revered, was no longer seen on the temple steps. Today, few remember the name. Fewer still believe it ever existed. And yet, deep in the folds of forest near the Kulin Hills, a rare bloom appears once a year. Locals don't pick it. They simply nod, smile, and let it be. And maybe that's the lesson behind these lost vegetables. Not every leaf must be harvested. Not every root must be classified. Some things, some tastes, belong to time, to place, to the people who once dreamed of them. And while we may not reclaim these vegetables in our gardens, we might just recover them in our imagination. where memory lingers and forgotten flavors bloom. So, with that, let us gently close the lid on this curious pot of vanished ingredients and thank the Khmer Empire for a menu half remembered, wholly fascinating, and still, somehow, alive in the silence of the jungle. Sleep well. And now, as the last images of temple gardens and vanished vegetables fade from view, you begin to feel the hush settling over your thoughts that you've wandered through flooded fields and overgrown ruins, traced recipes no longer written down, and imagined the bittersweet taste of a flower no one dares pick. These were stories told not in grand battles or heroic sagas, but in steam rising from clay pots, in seeds passed hand to hand, in quiet meals beneath the trees. The world of the Khmer Empire is quieter now, softer, but it still breathes, in forgotten corners of old forests, in the scent of herbs growing wild beside a crumbled step, and in the dreams of those who remember just enough to wonder. You feel your breath slow, your body heavier, the kind of weight that isn't burden, but rest. The last embers of story glow gently now, like fireflies in a mist. You don't need to hold on to all the details. Let them drift. Let them settle like pollen on water. And if, sometime tomorrow, a thought of Tiaro Nong or floating gardens returns to you like the aftertaste of a half-remembered meal, let it be a gift. A quiet souvenir from a place the waking world no longer keeps on maps. For now, the journey is over. The trail has gone still. The only step left to take is inward, toward dreams where nothing is lost. Only sleeping. Good night.